A new, very detailed report about the meta in Pokemon TCG Pocket has just been released. And in this post, it takes the top 30 plus meta decks and compares them to one another. And in this deep dive, we're going to look at the best performing decks and why they're the best performing decks, and take a look at all the new emerging meta decks that have arrived thanks to the continuous shift that Mythical Island has provided the game, and then also look at why those decks have emerged. So without any further ado, let's dive right into it. So first off, a huge thanks to the user OA. They have put together a bunch of data into really informative graphs that covers about 200 games per meta deck between 20 different players, totaling to about 38,314 games played, so we can get this information. But first, let's take a look at the top 15 decks that have been performing the best thanks to Mythical Island. And the first deck is Mewtwo EX and Gardevoir. This is the one deck that has remained mostly unchanged despite Mythical Island's set of new cards being introduced. Besides Mew EX kind of being added in instead of Baby Mewtwo, and the Mythical Slab being a staple in that deck, if anything, Mewtwo EX and Gardevoir has stayed the same, but only just gotten a little bit stronger. However, despite all the meta changes, Mewtwo EX and Gardevoir actually doesn't have many bad matchups despite the changes that have happened in the past month. If we take a look at the opponent archetype when using this deck, Mewtwo EX and Gardevoir don't really have many super good matchups. However, it hardly has any bad ones. The fact that it only has two matchups that put it below 40% win rate, which is Gyarados EX and Greninja, and also Sizzlipede and Weezing, Mewtwo EX and Gardevoir is that perfect deck where you don't have to worry about what deck the opponent is using. Gyarados EX and Greninja was a hotly used meta deck for quite a while since Mythical Island first came out. The usage of that deck has gone down because players have found better meta decks to counter Pikachu EX, which is still very strong in the meta. And ironically enough, those new meta decks that are there to take out Pikachu EX also counter the Gyarados EX, with most of those new meta decks using Hitmonlee for that 30 damage to the bench, which is awful against a Magikarp. But anyway, back to Mewtwo EX, we can see that even though there's an even matchup across the board, it does have a lot of favourable ones. It has a 58% win rate against Celebi EX and Serperior, which might come as a surprise to some people. Even I thought Celebi EX might actually eke out against Mewtwo EX in terms of that raw damage in the late game. But it looks like just relying on that RNG, no matter how many coin flips you have, sometimes just doesn't work, while Mewtwo EX is a set 150 damage guaranteed for each turn when you've got that Gardevoir in the bench. And even better yet, Mewtwo EX and Gardevoir is also a very strong deck to use against Pikachu EX and Zebstrika. However, if people are using Raichu or Zapdos EX in their Pikachu EX decks, the win rate does drop to 50% for Mewtwo. But honestly, compared to how strong Pikachu EX decks are, still to this day, 50% is a big win for Mewtwo. Any Darkness deck like Weezing and Sizzlipede is obviously going to be strong against Mewtwo. In fact, that's why I think one of the main reasons why Mewtwo EX decks are so standard across the board is because nobody's really using Darkness-based decks. It's not that they're weak or anything, but just like Metal decks, there's just not many cards to really make a strong deck from them. But really, the main reason Mewtwo EX decks are doing very well right now is that the Druddigon Wall meta is actually in their favor. Any type of meta where you have to stall is really good for Mewtwo EX decks. That's why we see a 58% win rate with Golem Druddigon decks, 60% win rate against Charizard and Moltres EX decks, and as well Aerodactyl EX and Primate decks. You're not really having to evolve Mewtwo on the active spot, which really pulls a lot of power away from Aerodactyl EX. So yeah, a lot of positive win rate matchups for Mewtwo and Gardevoir. Gyarados and Greninja, on the other hand, which is a newer meta deck, again, still a very good matchup against Mewtwo EX because of the health pool Gyarados has, and does really well against any fire decks like Arcane EX and Moltres EX, Charizard EX, Moltres EX, all of those archetypes, but again, suffers by two main things: Pikachu EX decks and the newly formed meta decks, which involve Aerodactyl, Primeape, Hitmonlee, Farfetch'd, and Marshadow. So still quite a lot of good matchups there, but also some really bad ones. Celebi EX and Superior actually turns out to be kind of a worse version of the Mewtwo and Gardevoir decks. Suffering against Mewtwo, suffering against Gyarados, which was built to counter Celebi, by the way. And whilst it is a good deck against the infamous Pikachu EX decks, it just has way too many bad matchups to make it a reliable deck to continuously use. Pikachu EX and Zebstrika has a lot of decks built to counter against it specifically, which is why we see a few negative matchups. Specifically, any deck that's using Golem, for instance, is really bad for Pikachu EX. Even Druddigon, which is definitely in the meta right now, is a good counter against Pikachu. But again, a lot of these fighting archetype decks are coming out of the ground now, which is making hell for Pikachu, finally. If you swap out Zebstrika for Raichu and Lieutenant Surge, it does get a little bit easier. But again, we're starting to see the Pikachu EX meta start to slow down. Golem and Druddigon actually doing quite well despite a few bad matchups. But focusing on one of the newer meta decks that is a bit further down, which is the Aerodactyl EX and Primeape decks, they're actually seeing a lot of favourable matchups despite it being built around Pikachu EX in mind. It does pretty well against Blaine aggro decks, which aren't being used as much right now. And that's because it probably has more of an aggressive early game than Blaine decks. Let's not forget, Primeape is a stage 1 Pokemon that can deal 50 damage with just one energy card. And that Aerodactyl EX can be pretty painful for Blaine aggro decks because they need to rely on evolving, especially when they're in the active spot. But unfortunately, it does fall a bit short if people start using Executors in their Celebi decks. That's likely because Executor EX can one-shot anything in that deck except for Aerodactyl EX with just one single heads. Not to mention, it has a lot of HP in that deck with Erica and Potion, which is a good combat against revenge killing from Marshadow. And if we look at the meta landscape from this graph, using the two most popular deck archetypes, which are Mewtwo EX and Gyarados EX, we can see that Pokemon TCG Pocket is doing really well at balancing these decks. There is not one Pokemon deck out there that is just better than all the rest. In fact, this is why Mewtwo and Gardevoir EX is such a popular deck to this day from day one since the game came out, is because it's perfectly 50% across the board, which is considered probably one of the best decks to play right now. And you can see a lot of these different decks just congregating to that 50% margin. If you're struggling to understand exactly what this graph is trying to show us, it means that Pokemon TCG Pocket has done a good job with the new set of cards. And then here's the same graph, but a bit different, just the archetypes ranked by overall win rate. And in the top, we can see the Aerodactyl EX and Primeape decks, and the Aerodactyl EX and Farfetch'd decks, which personally I've been using myself. Now you're probably thinking like, okay, why is Aerodactyl EX and Primeape like all the way at the top? These decks are built to go against some of the most popular meta decks currently right now, which is why it's seeing such a high win rate. It's going against decks that are built to fight against it, which is kind of like a forced favorable win rate, if you will. The ones I'm most interested in are the ones that are more closer to the 50% margin. Anything above 55% is probably just a niche deck. And it's good to see that the two most played decks for me is in the 50% margin, which is the Mewtwo EX and Gardevoir and Golem decks. And any decks that are just in the 50 to 55% win rate margin, we can see are using Greninja. And again, this is just a response to the Drugadon Wall meta deck. Attacks that deal damage to benched Pokemon is just becoming so much stronger now, because a lot of decks are placing basic Pokemon with a good health pool onto the active that deals damage when you deal damage to it, with no intention to attack back with one of its moves, to force players to make decks that deal damage to the backline where the opponent is trying to assemble their cards. And personally, what I really like about this dataset is that people are using a lot of non-EX niche cards to do specific amounts of damage to Pokemon decks that revolve around an EX card. And I kind of dig this. I like decks that use lighter, more chip-based damage attacks from normal cards. Players are starting to realize just how much of a risk utilizing an EX card all the time is, because those 2 points you can't afford to lose too early. Which is why I really love using decks like Golem. I think when opponents realize they have to knock out 3 cards to win, it makes it really tough for them to stop me from finally getting to my golem and then using guard press. And perhaps that's why I think Pikachu EX has been such a difficult archetype to work around, because we have many aggro decks that don't utilize many EX cards to counter those slower EX archetypes that need a bit more time to get energy onto their big cards before bringing them to the active. Whereas Pikachu EX is kind of like a perfect blend of that. You're putting the Pikachu EX right on the front to deal 90 damage as quickly as possible. But it looks like it has finally found its match with many of these fighting archetypes, especially with Marshadow. But moving on, let's take a look at the win rates for low game volume decks. What that means is these decks haven't had much play yet. These are decks that haven't reached 39 wins or 39 losses just yet. And this is more of a prediction on where the meta will move before the new set comes into play. And those top 5 decks that we'll likely see in the meta very soon are Dragonite and Greninja, Greninja and Farfetch'd, Greninja and Golduck, and finally, which I find very interesting, is Golem and Chatot. The one thing all these decks have in common is that they can happily live within the Druddigon wall meta. All of these Pokemon are built around either dealing high amounts of damage and then taking less damage themselves, which is Golem, or dealing damage to the bench with Greninja and Dragonite. The reason Golduck is in there, however, is based on what I mentioned in a previous video before Mythical Island even came out, which is to prevent the opponent from using supporter cards and thus slowing them down, so that you, as the player using Golduck, can assemble your Greninja in the backline more securely. Farfetch'd is just becoming far more stronger for early game damage now, especially now that you can rely on Marshadow in the back. And we've talked about Chatot on this channel before about its drawing ability of pulling more cards very, very quickly, and then Dragonite for the potential for massive damage on the bench. Personally, I'm loving these upcoming meta decks. I think they're really exciting to use. Still has that touch of RNG, as you should expect in Pokemon TCG Pocket, but are just different ways of playing than the meta we've seen just gone and the meta before Mythical Island even came in. So, with the new event coming up where you have to win 5 wins consecutively, what decks should you be practicing with before that event arrives? Well, thanks to OA, they've provided a few decks that they believe will be very strong in the meta going forward. First up is the Dragonite and Greninja deck, which uses 2 Froakie, 2 Frogadier, 2 Greninja, 2 Dratini, 2 Dragonair, 2 Dragonite, 1 Kangaskhan, 2 Professor's Research, 2 Potions, 2 Pokeballs, and 1 X-Speed. A very simple deck that doesn't use any Sabrinas or Giovannis, because it simply doesn't need to. I personally will be checking this deck out because in the end game, it'll eventually be able to deal nearly 200 damage per turn, and it doesn't have to be directly on the active. It can be spread out across numerous Pokemon. Next up is the Hitmonlee Aerodactyl EX deck, which I've actually been using right now. That is 2 Hitmonlee, 2 Aerodactyl EXs, 2 Marshadows, 2 Farfetch'd, 2 Professor's Research, 2 Sabrinas, 2 Giovannis, 2 X-Speeds, 2 Pokeballs, 2 Old Ambers. The reason I really like this deck is Hitmonlee is just perfect against Magikarp. Plus, it's a really good 30 damage guarantee to the bench that can make your opponent panic. Plus, the Farfetch's early damage is just really strong right now. And because Farfetch'd is easy to knock out, players are a bit more reserved knocking it out, especially if you have a Marshadow in the bench with 1 energy attached to it. Because then you can just swing in with 100 damage, and then in total you're dealing 140 damage in 2 moves. It's enough to take out most EX cards. The Aerodactyl EX is there to prevent the opponent from evolving on the active spot, which makes it a bit more difficult for them. However, I've not seen this really utilized that much. I usually use Aerodactyl EX more of a damage sponge in the late game, whilst also dealing 80 damage with Land Crush, which only requires 2 energy. By then, I expect to have knocked out at least 1 EX or 2 separate Pokemon cards, and that Land Crush is just to sweep out any remaining Pokemon, especially if I need to use a Sabrina to bring in any other Pokemon that has been damaged to Hitmonlee, for example. I really love this deck. It's really good against the current meta that is out there. But if you're seeing any players use any newer decks, it might suffer. It's hard to say right now because it's very early. But I've been enjoying it, but I haven't had a secure win rate like I have with Mewtwo EX, for example. You can change it up though by using Primeape. And this deck archetype comes with 2 Mankeys, 2 Primeapes, 2 Aerodactyl EXs, 2 Marshadows, 1 Hitmonlee, 2 Professor's Research, 2 Sabrinas, 1 Giovanni, 2 Old Ambers, 2 X-Speeds, and 2 Pokeballs. I personally haven't used this deck yet, but just looking at the early game damage that Primeape can deliver, it's definitely there to take out those Pikachu EX decks specifically. But this deck definitely looks quite exciting to me, so I definitely will try this at some point later on before the new set arrives. And if you want to counter that deck, you have the Celebi and Executor EX deck. I won't talk too much about this deck because it's simply a counter to the deck that I just talked about. We have already talked about how unreliable Celebi EX decks are right now in the meta, but the Executor EX definitely brings in some more security, even though it is still a coin flip. We mentioned it before, Executor EX can knock out any Pokemon in the Primeape Aerodactyl EX deck besides Aerodactyl itself. But I know the Celebi EX deck is really fun to use, so if you want to continue using it, I recommend putting Executor EX in there. Next up is the Psyduck and Greninja deck that I mentioned briefly earlier. That consists of 2 Psyduck, 2 Golduck, 2 Froakie, 2 Frogadier, 2 Greninja, 2 Professor's Research, 2 Sabrinas, 1 Giovanni, 2 Pokeballs, 2 Potions, and 1 X-Speed. As mentioned before, Psyduck is specifically there to slow down the opponent's deck. Supporters are bigger now than ever and only going to get more and more stronger. As I mentioned in the previous video, Psyduck's only going to get more stronger the more supporter cards are introduced to the game. And then once the opponent gets to their mid game, Golduck can come in and start dealing 70 damage. And then Greninja is at free 20 damage to any of the opponent's Pokemon. Or you can go for a mix of that by using this deck, which is 2 Froakie, 2 Frogadier, 2 Greninjas, 2 Marshadows, 2 Farfetch, and 1 Hitmonlee. It's a bit of a mishmash of both those deck archetypes coming together, and I might use this deck to see how it plays out. But that is the meta currently so far before the new set arrives in Pokemon TCG Pocket, which is expected in late January. So we've probably got 3 more weeks of this meta before it all changes once again. But let me know what decks you're using in this current meta and have you found any success with them? Let me know all about it in the comments down below. We try to read all of them. And now let's move on to opening 10 booster packs of Mythical Island. Okay, so let's go for a 10 packet open. So let's see what we get. Okay, so no animations. That's not amazing. Blue. Well, hopefully it will be better than the last one, because we didn't get like anything in the last 10. So Golem. That's nice. Chatot. Graveler. And nope, nothing there. Pikachu. Servine. Okay, not looking good so far. Magikarp. Ah, there we go. Full Art Vaporeon. Very nice. Okay, next we have another Dedenne. Phenomenal. This is my 7th one. I'm going to take a screenshot of that. Loving life. And then a Leaf. Okay, pack 8. Oh, Magikarp. Pack 9. Pidgeot EX. I've already got this, but still pretty good. Happy with that. And Jojo. Okay, so that's all we got. I mean, not bad pack opening. There was 3 hits, but you know, 2 of them I already have. I've got like 7 Dedennes at the moment, so not liking that much. So 1 card that I didn't get in this set so far in these 10 packs. So not great, but there you go. But yeah, that's the 10 pack open. Guys, if you want to watch another Pokemon video, it should be appearing on the end screen now.